This section of Scripture is one of the most controversial sections of the New Testament. Uh, and because the passage is perceived as contradicting the Apostle Paul's teaching on salvation by faith. In fact, Martin Luther called James a right straw epistle because of this passage. While he said that, I'm not sure he totally disagreed with James. Consider a couple of statements from his intro to Romans. Faith cannot help doing good works constantly. It doesn't stop to ask if good works ought to be done, but before anyone asks, it has already done them and continues to do them without ceasing. Anyone who does not do good works in this manner is an unbeliever. He also said, thus it is just as impossible to separate faith and works as it is to separate heat and light from fire. So I'm not so sure he fully believed what he said as an epistle of straw with those comments. And he had reason for his belief about works and faith. He was facing a system, and he practiced that system of meritorious works to gain his own salvation. And it ate at him a lot. So, as we're looking at James chapter 2, James had dealt with favoritism in the first part of the chapter, about how that the wealthy individuals that came to church were favored, and those who were less wealthy, maybe even in poverty, were treated with dishonor and disrespect. And James was saying this shouldn't be the case. Now, we sometimes think that the book of James is kind of disjointed, but it's pretty complex and tightly packed together. He was already talking about the wealthy and the poor in chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. He's talking about the doers of the word in chapter 1, verses 22 through 25. And he's talking about pure religion in verse 27 of chapter 1. And when you look at those items, that's what you deal with in chapter 2. That's what you deal with in chapter 2. So, what can we say about this section? Notice that in verses 17, 20, and 26, James says this: faith without works is dead, is worthless. And he says dead again. You may have a version of the Bible that says dead in verse 20 as well. So James is asking a question. What value or what good is faith? without a demonstration of faith. Or we may say it, without deeds or without works. Anybody can say, I have faith. In fact, Warren Wiersbe looks at this section of Scripture as three types of faith. Dead faith is the first title that he gives, and he uses verses 14 through 17 to discuss that. And what he talks about as dead faith is mental assent. I agree with the doctrines of Christ. I know about them. I know about them. But I believe them. Don't necessarily practice them, but I believe them. I have faith. That's sometimes called easy believism. You do whatever your denomination says that saves you, and then you basically live however you want to. That also happens with us too. So don't say just anybody. And his point is this does not save. This does not make you right with God if you live that way. And then he brings it to a very practical instance. There is a brother or sister among you who have a specific need. They're hungry. They don't have adequate clothes. In fact, they're probably pretty close to starving. And so you say, go in peace, be warm, and be filled. Now, the go in peace was a Jewish farewell blessing. But in this case, it becomes a curse. Because what are you really asking? Go away? Leave me alone. I don't want to have anything to do with your problem. Now, this may look different from time to time. In this situation, it sounds like you just hand them some food, you give them some clothes. But sometimes it may call you to be more involved. It may call you to be more involved. Maybe you have to help a situation with a job. Or maybe you have to help with a mental health issue. And those are tough. Maybe you have to help with a domestic violence issue. Maybe you need to help with them going to an employer and asking some stuff. It can be messy business. So, the first thing that James is telling us, faith is demonstrated by assisting fellow believers and fellow humans even. And do you hear the echo of the Sermon on the Mount? Do you hear the echo of Matthew 25 in the teaching of Jesus? Do you hear those echoes there? So, are there any questions or comments over that little section? And this can be called dead faith, according to Warren Wiersbe. Faith that's just intellectual, mental assent, easy believism. I know about the gospel, but it doesn't impact my life in any way. It doesn't impact how I deal with my fellow believer, my neighbor, anyone that I come into contact with. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
John 28. What shall we do that we God? This is the work of God.
Believe in the Christ. And that was Josh's message. Believe in the Christ. And when you believe in the Christ, it changes your life. You know, belief should change your life. So, any other comments at this point? Thank you. Again, in that 17th verse, so faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Okay, so then you move into the next section, which Wiersbe called demonic faith. Demonic faith. And you have a conversation going on here. But someone will say, I have faith. You have works. James says, I will show you my faith by my works. They kind of divided faith and works like spiritual gifts. You have the gift of evangelism. You have the gift of mercy. Well, I have faith. I have faith. And there is, I think, in the Corinthian letter, a passage about miraculous faith, but that's not what James is talking about. James is just talking about a person saying, I have faith. James says, if I don't see any evidence of it, how can I know you have faith? So, with this faith, as Wiersbe puts it, he talks about believing in God. You believe in one God. You believe that God is one, you do well. That is a statement of Jewish faith. It comes from Deuteronomy 6:4. It is the Shema. They recited it daily. Believing that God is one, is that a good thing? Yeah. But James said, don't stop with just the intellectual belief that God is one. Act on that. He says to the people, the person that he's talking to, which probably not really talking to anyone, just set that up as an argument. You know, the demons believe that there is one God. Not only do they believe there is one God, they have an emotional response. They shudder, they tremble. And we think about some things in the Gospels. When Jesus encountered demon-possessed people, they knew who he was. They knew him as the Messiah. They knew him as the Son of God. They also recognized that he had authority over them. Many times they would attempt to cry out, "What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth?" And what would he do? Shut up. Be quiet. They also recognized that he was going to be a judge over them at some point. The one with the pigs, they asked him not to send them into the abyss, but let them go into the pigs. So they acknowledged who he was. But this doesn't make a change for the demons. They're still demons. They're still condemned. And so James, at this point, will tell us that faith without works is worthless. Again, your version may say that it is dead in verse 20, or empty. So, any comments or points that you want to make on that section? Okay. Move into the last one. That can be called dynamic or living faith. And again, this is Wiersbe's outline. So, dead faith was just, I believe, I know the facts. Demonic faith was, okay, I know the facts and they shake me up a little bit. But, you know, I'm not really going to do anything about them. So we come to dynamic or living faith. And it involves the whole person. It involves the intellect. It involves the emotion. And it involves the will. And so at this point, James presents two characters, or two examples of what living faith or dynamic faith should look like. The first one is Abraham. And let's be honest, with this text of Scripture, you should have some problems that should cause you to study some more. Why? Because James seems to present things out of order. Okay? Because he says, was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with works, and by works, faith was brought to completion. Thus, the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. The statement, he believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, occurs in chapter 15 of Genesis. Yeah. It occurs in chapter 15. The sacrifice of Isaac occurs in Genesis chapter 22. And going back to Genesis 15, Isaac wasn't there yet. It will be a number of years before Isaac is there. Possibly about 25. And then Isaac is possibly around 30 years old when he is sacrificed on the altar. So it's a good time span there. But what's James's point? God made the covenant with Abraham. Abraham believed that covenant, that he would have many descendants. He believed that he would still have many descendants, even if he offered Isaac, the promised son, on the altar. In fact, Hebrews 11, starting around verse 8, going through 19, makes the point that in Abraham's head, Isaac was as good as dead. But he believed God could bring him to life again, could fulfill the promise that he made to him in Genesis 15. Does that make sense? And again, it takes some wrestling with. I see why. Or at least I think I see why. People have a problem with this passage of Scripture. Abraham's faith was shown to be complete and mature at this time. The covenant of Genesis 12, 1 through 3, of Genesis 15, 6, was renewed and restated in Genesis 22, 15 through 18. So, let me see if I can point this out. Back up in verse 22, there's a word play in Greek, and I don't know Greek, so I can't exactly explain that. But his faith, my version says, you see that faith was active along with his works, and by works, faith was brought to completion, or that works worked with faith. Yeah. So they were working together to bring about this point of justification, or the faith being brought to completion. And at this point, Abraham was called the friend of God. There's two passages in the Old Testament, 2 Chronicles 20, verse 7, and Isaiah 41, verse 8, that calls Abraham the friend of God. Now, let's think about John 15, verses 12 through 17. Jesus said, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. Friends of Jesus do what he commands. You are my friends if you do what I command. So, friend of God, you do what he says. Look at Rahab. And you would think, well, and maybe this doesn't need to be thrown out like this, but I'll do it anyway. Who was Rahab? A prostitute. She was a Canaanite. She was an enemy of God's people. And then she was a believer. She did good to God's people. She is one of the four women. Actually, she's the second named woman in the genealogy of Jesus. She hid the spies. She sent them on another way. Again, she's kind of like the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. The Samaritan woman, she was outside the realm. Jesus talked to her. She became an evangelist. So the spies entered the household of Rahab. She talks with them. She hides them. She protects them. She sends them on another way. She saves her household, her family, and becomes part of the Israel of God. And again, James ends again with faith without works is like a dead body. Body and spirit separated. Okay. That's it.